the plain begins before the city does. Across the northwest of what is now Cambodia, there lies a low floor of alluvium, laid down over a long age by the rivers that fall from the hills, and it is nearly level, dropping only a few meters across many kilometers of ground, so that a person standing in the dry season sees the land run out flat toward a soft horizon of forest and rice. To the northeast, the ground rises into the sandstone shoulders of Phnom Kulen, a range of low-tabled hills from which the rivers and the building stone both came, and to the south the plain slopes down by the gentlest of gradients toward the Tonle Sap, the great lake that holds the center of the country. Between the hills and the lake, the Siem Reap and the Puok rivers run southward across the plain in shallow beds, carrying the runoff of the wet months down toward the water, and along their courses the soil is deep and dark and good for rice. The climate here is monsoonal, divided cleanly into two long seasons, a dry half of the year when the rivers shrink and the fields harden under a high sun, and a wet half when the rains come up from the southwest and the sky stays heavy for months together and the low ground fills. The forest that covers the unworked land is a dry, deciduous forest, open beneath its canopy in the dry season and dense and green in the wet, threaded with the standing pools that the rains leave behind. And it holds the hardwoods and the resin trees and the palms that the people of the plain drew on. The Tonle Sap itself behaves unlike most lakes, for it is joined to the Mekong by a single short river, and when the Mekong rises with the monsoon, the water is pushed backward, up the connecting river and into the lake, until the Tonle Sap swells to several times its dry season size and drowns the surrounding lowlands in a broad and shallow flood. Then, as the Mekong falls again, the lake reverses once more and drains slowly back down its river, leaving behind a wide belt of wet soil and stranded fish and a renewed coat of silt, and the flooded forest at its margin becomes for part of the year a great breeding ground for the fish that fed the plain. This annual reversal, the rise and the long withdrawal, set the terms for everything that was built on the plain above it, and it set them in advance, before any wall was raised. Because the people who came to live here came to a landscape whose central fact was water that arrived and departed on a schedule of its own. The plain offered a few things in steady supply, and they were the deep soil for the rice, the fish that bred in the flooded forest at the lake's edge, and the long, gentle gradient that let water be led wherever a channel was cut and held wherever an embankment was raised. It offered the stone as well, but at a distance, up in the hills to the northeast, and the winning and the moving of that stone down onto the plain became one of the long collective labors of the place. A traveler crossing the plain in the dry season, before the city stood and after it emptied alike, would have walked for the better part of a day over flat ground under open forest, crossing the shallow rivers at their fords, passing the low rises where the soil drained and the higher trees grew, skirting the standing pools, and seeing the line of Kulen always to one side, blue with distance and unchanging from hour to hour. The land gives little resistance and little natural shelter. It is a floor and a basin, warm through the year, lit hard and dusty in the dry months and gray and streaming in the wet, and its single great motion is the slow annual breathing of the lake to the south. The seasons here are not a matter of warm and cold, but of wet and dry, the temperature holding high and even across the year while the water comes and goes. And that division of the year into a season of abundance of water and a season of its scarcity is the deepest fact of the place, older than any building and outlasting all of them. Onto this floor, over the course of some 6 centuries, a capital was assembled by degrees and then, by degrees, let go, and the floor is still here, holding the shape of what was set upon it, level and patient under the same 2 seasons that governed it from the start. The rivers still falling from Kulen, the lake still rising and draining to the south, the forest still closing over the worked ground wherever the work has ceased. The buildings that endure at Angkor are the temples, and the temples were raised in two materials above all, in laterite for the mass and the foundation, and in sandstone for the worked and visible faces. Laterite is a soil rather than a true rock, a red and porous iron-rich earth that lies in beds across much of the region, and it has the useful property of being soft enough to cut with iron tools when it is freshly dug and still damp, and of hardening on exposure to the air until it holds as a coarse and durable block. The Khmer builders cut it into rough rectangular masses and laid it for the platforms, for the hidden cores of the towers, and for the long enclosing walls and the causeways, where its pitted and uneven surface did not need to be seen, and where its weight and stability did the work. Over and around this, they set the gray-green sandstone brought down from the beds at Phnom Kulen, a fine even stone that took a clean edge and held a carved line through the centuries. And it is in this sandstone that the galleries, the towers, the lintels, the door frames, and the long carved walls were made. The signature form of the great temples is the Temple Mountain, a built representation of a sacred peak rising in receding terraces toward a crowning group of towers, and Angkor Wat, laid out in the first half of the 12th century under the king. The inscriptions named Suryavarman II is the fullest surviving statement of it. Angkor Wat is a vast moated rectangle, its outer water-filled enclosure measuring well over 1.5 kilometers on its longer sides, approached from the west along a broad raised stone causeway carried across the moat, and within the enclosure, the temple climbs through 3 concentric galleried courts to a high central platform bearing 5 towers set in the pattern called a quincunx, 4 at the corners and 1 raised highest at the center above the principal sanctuary. Its main axis, against the usual eastern orientation of Khmer temples, faces west, and that orientation has been read together with the temple's dedication to Vishnu and with the Western association of the direction in the funerary thought of the time, and observers have measured alignments along its axis to the rising sun at the turn of the year. A few generations after Angkor Wat, under the king, the inscriptions named Jayavarman VII, the walled city of Angkor Thom was laid out as a great square enclosure some 3 kilometers on a side, ringed by a moat and a high laterite and sandstone wall pierced by monumental gates, each gate approached by a causeway whose flanking balustrades are carved as long rows of figures holding the body of a serpent. And at the center of this city the temple of the Bayon was raised. The Bayon is built in a denser and more crowded manner than Angkor Wat, its plan compact and its upper level a close cluster of towers, each carved on its faces with large serene outward-looking heads, so that a person moving through the upper terrace is met on every side and at every turn by the same broad countenance repeated in the stone. Along the front of the royal enclosure within the same city run the long raised terraces, faced with carved elephants and with Garuda figures, platforms from which the court looked out over the open ground, and behind them stood the timber palace, of which only the stone foundations and the small pyramid temple of Phimianicus survive. The Khmer built all of this without the true arch, for they did not use the radiating wedge-shaped voussoir that locks a span across an opening, and instead they roofed their galleries and passages by corbelling, laying each course of stone slightly inward over the one beneath it, until the 2 sides met at the top in a high narrow ridge. This gives the interior galleries their characteristic tall and pinched profile, and it limited the width that any single roofed space could cover, so that the great temples are not broad halls but lattices of narrow roofed corridors wrapped around solid cores, the volume given over to mass rather than to enclosed space. The blocks themselves were large, and they were dressed and fitted with great care, set close without mortar in the finest work and held in places by iron cramps poured into matching slots, cut in adjoining stones, and by mortise joints worked into the surfaces. And the largest temples consumed millions of such blocks, quarried, floated, dragged, and lifted into place along earthen ramps. The surfaces were then carved in position on the standing wall, and the depth and consistency of that carving across acres of stone is one of the measurable achievements of the site. For the lower galleries of Angkor Wat carry continuous low relief, running for hundreds of meters without a break, and the walls of the lesser temples are worked with framed narrative scenes, with doorway guardians, with floral and geometric bands, and with rows of standing celestial figures. The construction proceeded from the inside outward and from the bottom upward, the laterite core and the sandstone facing rising together, course by course, and the whole held its line so well that the principal towers of Angkor Wat still stand plumb above their moat after some 8 centuries. The corbelled vaults still closed, the carved walls still legible along their full length. The form that culminated in Angkor Wat and the Bayon did not arrive complete, and it can be followed through a long sequence of earlier capitals raised on and around the plain across more than 2 centuries before the greatest temples were begun. The earliest of the major works lie to the southeast, at the place the inscriptions call Hariharalaya, in the group of temples around the modern village of Roluos, where the kings of the later 9th century built in brick and in the first dressed sandstone. There stands Preah Ko, a row of brick towers raised to the royal ancestors and faced once with a carved lime stucco. And there stands Bakong, the first of the large stepped temple mountains, a tiered sandstone pyramid set within a broad moat and ringed by subsidiary brick shrines. And at Lolei, a further group was raised on an island set in the middle of a great reservoir, so that the linking of temple and held water that would mark Angkor was already present in this earlier center. Toward the year 900, the seat of the kings was moved northwest onto the plain that became Angkor proper, and there Yasovarman raised his temple mountain upon the natural hill of Phnom Bakheng, a stepped pyramid carrying many small towers in ordered ranks about a central group, the first of the great temple mountains on the plain itself. And he laid out around his city the immense reservoir of the East Barai, the embanked rectangle of which is still legible on the ground, though its water is long gone. After a brief removal of the court to Kokar away to the northeast, where a tall and steep pyramid was raised in a few short years, the center returned to the plain, and through the middle of the 10th century the kings added further temple mountains, Prerup, with its warm brick and laterite towers rising on their terraces, and the East Maban, an island temple set upon the surface of the East Baray, and reached, while the reservoir held water, by boat. In the same century, away to the northeast near the hills, the small temple of Bante Srey was raised in a fine rose-colored sandstone by a Brahmin of the court rather than by a king, and the close grain of that stone allowed a carving of a depth and a delicacy unmatched on the plain, the figures and the foliage cut nearly free of the ground, so that the temple is studied as the high point of Khmer relief, even though it is among the smallest of the monuments. Around the turn of the 11th century came Takeo, a high and austere pyramid of a hard greenish sandstone left almost wholly without carving, its plain terraces and bare towers showing the temple mountain reduced to its geometry. The work halted before the decoration was begun. Then, in the middle of the 11th century, the Baphuon was raised as a vast temple mountain near the center of what would become the walled city, a great bronze-crowned pyramid of which much had fallen in the centuries since, and which was taken apart and set up again stone by stone in modern times, in one of the longest and most difficult works of reconstruction attempted on the site. The blocks numbered and the structure relearned before it could be rebuilt. Within the royal enclosure stood the smaller pyramid of Phimianicus, the chapel of the palace, and around all of these, the lesser sanctuaries and the libraries and the gate towers multiplied. Read in order, this long sequence shows the Temple Mountain being refined across generations, the building material moving from brick toward laterite and then toward fine-dressed sandstone, the form moving from the natural hill pressed into service toward the wholly built and freestanding pyramid, the carving deepening and then, at Takeo, falling silent, and the scale rising steadily, until the accumulated craft of those 2 centuries was gathered and surpassed in the single enormous and fully carved achievement of Angkor Wat, and then turned, a few generations later, toward the crowded and inward and face-crowned mass of the Bayon. The plain, in this way, holds not one architecture, but a whole development of one, a sequence that can be walked from the oldest brick towers of Roluos to the last great Buddhist temple at the center of the walled city, each stage dated by its inscriptions and legible in its stone. The winning of the stone and its carriage down to the plain was itself among the longest of the labors that the temples required, and the evidence for how it was done lies in the quarries, in the canals, and in the marks left on the blocks themselves. The gray-green sandstone of the great temples was cut from quarries on the southeastern flank of Phnom Kulen, some tens of kilometers from the building sites, where the worked faces of the rock, the half-detached and abandoned blocks, and the regular scars and channels of the extraction are still to be found among the forest, so that the source of the stone is not in doubt, and the manner of its cutting can be read directly from the quarry floor. The moving of that stone across the intervening distance was the harder problem, and the study of the channels and the old watercourses across the plain has indicated that the blocks were carried for much of the way by water, floated and hauled along canals that ran from the foot of the hills toward the temples, a route worked out from the alignment of the channels and from the position of the quarries, and one that would have spared the builders a great part of the effort that dragging so many heavy blocks overland would have demanded. The quantities involved were very large, for the estimates of the stone consumed by Angkor Wat alone run into several million dressed blocks and into many millions of tons of rock, every block of it cut at the quarry, brought down to the plain, lifted onto the rising structure, dressed to its final face, and then carved in position, and the same labor, multiplied across the dozens of major temples and the hundreds of lesser ones, gives some measure of the effort that the plain absorbed over its centuries of building. The blocks were moved and raised with ropes, with levers, with ramps of heaped earth built up against the rising terraces and cut away again when the work was done, and with the pulling of people and of elephants, and many of the blocks carry pairs of bored holes that have been read as the seatings for the wooden livers or the rigging by which they were lifted and shifted into their courses. Once in place, the stone was rubbed and dressed to a close joint. The finest work fitted so tightly that no mortar was needed, and only then was the carving begun upon the standing wall, so that the acres of consistent relief across the temples imply not a few hands but large trained workshops laboring in coordination over years, each course carved before the scaffolding moved on. The people who did this work are recorded, in their categories, in the inscriptions, for the Khmer kept a careful account of the dependent populations bound to the temples and the works. The people the inscriptions name as belonging to the foundations, assigned from villages across the kingdom to the service of a particular temple. And the great dedicatory steels count these dependents in the tens of thousands, attached to a single establishment, set down village by village, together with the rice and the oil and the cloth that the foundation consumed and dispensed in a year. The temple, read through these inscriptions, was an economic institution as much as a religious one, the center of a great estate of land and labor, drawing in the produce of its assigned villages and the work of its assigned people, and turning them to the maintenance of the cult and the raising and upkeep of the stone. And the same labor that built the temples maintained the reservoirs and the channels and the roads, organized through the obligations that the state and the temples held over the population of the plain. The carving and the building in this light are not the work of a moment of inspiration, but the long, steady output of an organized society, recorded in its own stone in the same measured hand that recorded the gods and the kings, the quarry marks and the lifting holes and the counted dependents together, describing a machine of stone and labor that ran for centuries, and that ceased in the end when the effort that drove it moved away and the counting stopped. What the quarries and the canals and the inscriptions give, taken together, is the means behind the monuments, the answer in earth and water and organized labor to the plain question of how so much stone was cut so far off and brought so far and raised so high and carved so consistently. And the answer is legible because the Khmer left the marks of the doing on the stone and the account of the doers in the inscriptions beside it. Most of Angkor was never made of stone, and that is the first thing the ground teaches about how the place was lived in. The temples were the houses of deities and of royal ancestors, and they were built to last in laterite and sandstone. But the people of the city lived in timber, in houses raised on wooden posts above the wet ground, roofed in thatch and palm leaf, and almost nothing of that ordinary city stands above the surface now, because the materials it was made of returned to the soil within a few decades of neglect. What remains of it is in the ground and in the shape of the ground, in the low occupation mounds that mark where houses once stood on raised dry platforms, in the household ponds dug beside them to hold water through the dry season, and in the faint rectilinear grid of garden plots and field boundaries that the people laid out around their homes, and that the survey has since traced across the plain. Read from the air and from careful survey on the ground, this pattern shows a settlement that was dispersed rather than dense, a low city spread thinly across many kilometers of plain. Its houses gathered loosely around the temples and strung along the channels and the embankments rather than packed behind a single defensive wall, so that Angkor at its height was less a compact town than a vast inhabited landscape of mounds and ponds and paddies woven through with water. In the early hours of an ordinary day, the work of this landscape was domestic and agricultural, and it began before the heat of the middle of the day had risen. Fires were lit under the raised floors and in the open yards, and the first meal of the day turned on rice, the staple that the surrounding paddies produced in quantity, boiled and eaten with what the ponds and the channels gave, for the household ponds and the wider net of canals held fish in abundance, and fish taken from the lake and the flooded forest, and the home ponds was the steady protein of the plain, eaten fresh and also preserved as paste and dried for the months when the catch was thinner. Water was carried up from the ponds in the cool of the early light. The animals were led out to the margins, and the household plots, the kitchen gardens and the fruit trees, and the stands of banana and areca set on the dry mounds, were tended before the sun stood high. The labor of the rice followed the season, the flooding and the puddling of the fields, and the transplanting of the seedlings, and the long wait and the harvest. And in the growing months, the morning took the working people out onto the bunded paddies that spread in every direction from the house mounds, the figures bent over the standing water of the fields. The pattern of all this is recoverable because the ground keeps it. The slightly raised squares of the old house platforms, the regular depressions of the ponds, the lines of the field banks softened but not erased, all of it surveyed and mapped across the plain, so that the dispersed living city, the part that left no standing wall and no carved stone, has been returned to view as a measured plan of mounds and water. It was a city without a single dense core in the ordinary sense. Its population spread across the engineered surface of the plain, each cluster of houses tied to its own water and its own rice. And in the morning the smoke of the cooking fires would have risen from across the whole spread of it, from the mounds set close around the temple enclosures, and from the mounds far out among the distant fields alike, a thin haze lifting off the plain as the light came up. The temples stood up out of this low domestic sea like islands of stone, and the people who served them and the people who farmed around them began their days in much the same way, with the fire and the rice and the fish and the carried water, under the same early light that still comes up flat across the plain. The carved walls of the temples, turning aside for a moment from gods and kings, show this ordinary morning world as well. The houses on their posts, the cooking pots over the fire, the women at the hearth, the men with their animals and their nets, so that the timber city that the soil did not keep was set down in the stone that it did. What the survey and the carving together give, in the end, is proportion. The stone that survives is a small fraction of what was here, and the timber city that is gone was by far the larger part, and the morning belonged to that timber city, to the fires under the raised floors, and the work in the gardens, and the long lines of figures going out across the wet fields, while the temples behind them caught the first of the day on their upper towers. The substance of Angkor can be set out as a short and well-understood list of materials, each with its own source and its own behavior, and together they account for very nearly everything the hands of the place produced. The first is laterite, the iron-rich soil that hardens in the air, dug from beds across the plain and cut into rough blocks for foundations, walls, and causeways, valued precisely because it was local, abundant, and easy to work while it was still fresh and damp from the ground. The second is the sandstone of Phnom Kulen, the gray-green fine-grained stone that carries the carving, quarried up in the hills and brought down onto the plain by water and by road, harder to win and far harder to move than the laterite, and reserved therefore for the surfaces that mattered, the facing of the temples, the lintels over the doorways, the colonnettes, the towers, and the long carved galleries. A softer and warmer rose-colored sandstone was used at a few sites, among them the small and exceptionally fine temple of Bantiye Shrey to the northeast, where the close grain of the stone allowed a depth and a crispness of carving unmatched elsewhere on the plain. The relief cut so deep in places that the figures stand nearly free of the ground. The earliest temples of the region, before Angkor reached its full extent, had been built differently again, in fired brick, laid in courses, and faced with a carved lime stucco, and a number of these brick towers still stand, their stucco gone or going, their brick cores weathered to a soft red, and the slow shift from brick toward dressed stone over the centuries is itself one of the readable changes in the record. Lime, burned from shell and stone and then slaked, served as mortar and as the medium of that early stucco, and it bound the brickwork where the later sandstone was set close and dry without it. Metal was worked too, and bronze above all, cast for the images of the deities, for ritual vessels and lamps, for fittings and ornament and the sheathing of doors, and a few large bronze figures and a great many smaller ones have survived to show the reach of the casting, including a large reclining bronze figure recovered in pieces from one of the reservoirs, though much of the metal that once filled and adorned the temples was taken away or melted in the centuries after the court withdrew. Iron was smelted and used for the tools and for the cramps that held the heavier stones, for the chisels that cut both the laterite and the sandstone, and for the implements of the field and the household. And the working of iron is among the crafts that the inscriptions and the carved scenes record. The ordinary domestic economy turned on ceramics, and the Khmer made their own stoneware, fired hard in kilns whose sites have been found and excavated, finished with green and brown glazes, in forms for cooking, storage, serving, and the table. And alongside this local ware, the ground across the whole site holds quantities of imported ceramics. Chinese stoneware and porcelain brought in along the trade routes over several centuries, so that the changing distribution of these foreign sherds has become one of the principal means by which the phases of the settlement are dated and mapped. Beyond the durable materials, there were the perishable ones that the climate has taken almost entirely. The timber that framed the houses and carried the wooden ceilings and the doors and the great roofs of the palaces, the palm and the thatch of the roofing, the cotton and the silk of the cloth, the lacquer, the basketry, the matting, and the long inventory of things made from the plants of the forest. And these survive only at second hand, in the impressions they left in the ground, in the depictions carved on the temple walls, and in the written accounts of those who saw them in use. The walls themselves are in this way a kind of catalogue, for the bas-reliefs show the boats and the carts and the carrying poles, the kitchen pots and the market scales, the looms and the fishing nets and the traps, the houses on their posts and the furniture within them, so that the perishable material world that the soil did not keep was recorded in the stone that it did. The marks of making are everywhere legible on the surviving stone, the regular scars of the quarry on the unseen back faces of the blocks, the slots cut for the iron cramps, the holes left for the wooden pegs and the lifting, the lines scored to guide the carving, and the unfinished passages where the work was begun and then left. And these marks let the sequence of the labor be read backward from the finished wall to the quarry face and the canal. What the materials describe, taken together, is a building economy of very great scale, resting on a narrow and intelligent base, a local soil that hardened into a usable stone, a hill of true stone within reach by water, a clay that fired and glazed and traveled, a metal cast for the gods in the court, and a vast surrounding world of wood and leaf and fiber that did the everyday work and has since gone quietly back into the ground. Angkor lay at the center of a web of roads and waterways, and the goods that moved along that web can be traced both in the ground and in writing. The first and largest of the flows were internal and local, the fish of the Tonle Sap and the rice of the plain, for the lake in its flooded months bred fish in extraordinary quantity in the drowned forest at its margin, and the surrounding paddies in a good year produced a surplus of grain, and these two staples, the protein of the water and the starch of the field, fed the dense service populations of the temples and the dispersed farming population alike, carried inward along the channels and the roads from the places where they were taken to the places where they were eaten. Outward from this productive core ran a network of raised stone and laterite causeways linking the capital to the provincial centers of the kingdom, reaching toward the temple city of Beng Mielia to the east, toward Phimai far to the northwest, and toward the other great foundations of the realm. And the rivers and canals carried the heavier traffic that the roads did not. Along the great roads, the bridges were built in the same corbelled stone as the temples, and several of these long laterite spans still stand and still carry a road across the rivers. Among them the bridge at Kampong Day, a span of many narrow corbelled arches stretching for the better part of 100 meters, its parapets carved as the bodies of serpents, among the oldest standing bridges of their kind anywhere. The inscriptions of Jayavarman VII, set up across the kingdom near the end of the 12th century, record a deliberate program of public foundations laid out along these routes, rest houses set at regular intervals to shelter travelers, and a series of houses described as places of healing established to serve the provinces. And the stones that named these foundations have been found at points along the old roads that let the system be reconstructed on the ground, the spacing of the rest houses marking the stages of a day's travel. The goods that came in from beyond the kingdom are most plainly visible in the ceramics, for the imported Chinese stoneware and porcelain that litter the site arrived along the maritime trade that reached up the rivers from the coast, and their styles and their dates let the periods of greatest exchange be measured against the reigns and the building phases. The fullest single account of all this comes from a visitor, Zhou Daguan, an envoy of the Yuan court of China, who traveled to Angkor and stayed through the year around 1296, and afterward wrote down at length what he had seen. And his record is the one sustained eyewitness description of the living city that has come down to the present. He described the markets and the goods set out in them, the dwellings of the people and the appearance of the houses, the customs of marriage and of mourning, the agriculture and the turning of the seasons, the manner of the court and the appearance of the king when he came out in procession, and his account, read against the carved walls and the excavated ground, has become one of the principal sources for the everyday economy and the social order of the place. From his report and from the archaeology together, the outward trade can be set down, the cotton and the woven cloth, the lacquer and the resins and the gums, the cardamom and the pepper, and the other spices and aromatics gathered from the forest, the kingfisher feathers prized far off for ornament, the beeswax, the hides, the rare woods, and the long inventory of products that the surrounding forests yielded, and that moved out toward the coast and into the wider network of the South China Sea and the routes beyond it. In return came the ceramics and the silks and the metals and the fine manufactured goods that the inscriptions and the carved scenes record as the furniture of the court and the temple, and the envoy noted which foreign things were prized and sought after, and which the Khmer made well enough for themselves. The picture that assembles from all of this is of a capital that ate from its own plain and its own lake, and traded outward in the produce of its forests, tied by a maintained system of roads, bridges, rest houses, and channels to its provinces, and through the mouths of the rivers to the sea and the long-distance trade. And it is a picture drawn from three agreeing kinds of evidence that rarely contradict one another: the goods themselves lying in the soil, the inscriptions cut in stone to record the foundations strung along the roads, and the single long account of the man who came, stayed the better part of a year, watched the markets and the processions, and wrote down what passed before him. Seen again toward the end of the day, the same city turns from the field and the temple workshop to the market and the household at rest, and the evening account is filled out by the very record that the trade left behind. For the envoy who described the goods also described the hours in which they changed hands and the manner of the people among whom he lived. The markets, by his report, were held in the open on the bare ground, without the permanent shops and the fixed streets of stalls that he knew from the cities of home, and the trade in them was carried on, for the most part, by women, who set out their wares on a mat or a length of cloth laid on the ground and dealt across the day, so that the cooler hours of the late afternoon found these open grounds at their fullest. The produce of the plain and the goods of the longer routes laid out side by side, the rice and the fish and the cloth and the imported ware changing hands as the heat went out of the day. The household in the evening returned to the same staples it had begun the day with, the rice and the fish, now cooked for the main and unhurried meal of the cooler hours, and the bathing and the washing that the heat of the day made necessary belonged to the end of it as much as to its beginning, carried out at the ponds and the channels that lay beside every cluster of houses, the water that the morning had carried up now serving the evening's ease. The temples in the evening were not quiet, for they were served by large attached populations whose whole work was the maintenance of the cult, and the scale of these populations is recorded directly in the stone, since the long dedicatory inscription of the Temple of Ta Prohm sets down the numbers assigned to that single foundation and counts them in the many thousands, the priests and the officiants, the attendants and the guardians, the dancers and the musicians, the servants and the cultivators of the temple's many villages of land. A whole dependent town gathered to the service of one house of the ancestors, with the rice and the cloth and the oil it consumed in a year all entered in the same accounting. As the light failed, the lamps were lit in the sanctuaries and along the galleries, and the carved dancers on the walls would have stood in the moving lamplight as the living dancers moved before the images in the evening rites, the one mirroring the other in the dim interiors. The smoke of the evening fires rose again across the dispersed city as it had risen in the morning, from the mounds set close about the enclosures and from the mounds far out among the fields, and the great sheets of still water that the city had made, the moats around the temples and the long rectangular reservoirs out on the open plain, took the last of the light and held the towers upside down in their motionless surfaces, and the flatness of the land and the stillness of the held water made that doubling a regular feature of the close of every clear day, rather than a rare one. The court at the center had its own evening, the audiences and the processions that the envoy watched and recorded, the king coming out with the marks and the regalia of his office, and the ordered ranks of his household and his guard about him. And that ceremonial evening at the heart of the walled city was the visible apex of a settlement whose broad base was the quiet domestic evening, repeated across many thousands of house mounds far out on the plain. The repetition is the substance of the place, for the morning and the evening of Angkor were built of the same elements, seen from two sides, the rice and the fish and the carried water and the tended ponds, the temples standing over the timber houses, the smoke lifting at both ends of the day, and the difference between the two was only the difference of the light and of the direction the work was facing, out toward the fields and the water in the morning, and inward toward the hearth and the market and the lamp-lit sanctuary as the day came down. When the lamps were at last put out and the markets cleared, and the last of the fires banked low under the raised floors, the city lay under a heavy warm darkness, the held water gone black and unmoving, the towers no longer reflected, but only sensed as deeper shapes against the sky, and the great engineered plain rested in the warmth until the flat light came up over it again. The temples of Angkor were the instruments of its religion, and the religion is documented in the stone with a fullness that removes most of the need to guess at it, for the Khmer cut inscriptions in great number, in Sanskrit verse for the praise of the gods and the kings, and in Old Khmer prose for the practical record of the endowments, naming the deities, the donors, the gifts, and the dates, and the walls themselves carry the iconography in carved relief across acres of stone. The earlier and longer tradition was Hindu, and the great gods of that tradition, Shiva and Vishnu above all, held the central sanctuaries, Shiva most often present in the form of the linga, the upright stone set on its pedestal that was the focus of his cult and the object over which the sanctuary was raised, and Vishnu present in his carved image and in the long narrative reliefs of his acts. Angkor Wat was dedicated to Vishnu, and its lower galleries carry continuous bas-reliefs of the god's mythology and of the great epics, among them the churning of the ocean of milk, in which the ranked figures of the gods and their opponents draw the body of an enormous serpent back and forth around a mountain set on the back of a turtle, turning the sea to win from it the drink of immortality. A single scene cut at length along one whole gallery and matched on the other walls by the battles of the epics and the procession of the king and his army. Across the surfaces of Angkor Wat and the other temples stand the carved celestial women, the Apsaras and the Devatas, rendered in their many thousands in low relief, each set in her own framed panel along the walls and the piers and the corners, distinguished one from another in dress and ornament and the arrangement of the hair. And the sheer number and the consistency of these figures is one of the measurable features of the carving and one of the marks of the labor the temples consumed. Under Jayavarman VII, near the end of the 12th century and into the 13th, the religion of the state turned toward Mahayana Buddhism, and that turn is written into the architecture as plainly as into the inscriptions, for the Bayon at the center of his new walled city belongs to it. And the great serene heads on its towers have been read in connection with the Buddhist figure of compassion that the rain favored. The face turned outward to the four directions over the whole of the city. The same king raised enormous temple foundations dedicated to his parents, the great temple of Ta Prohm to the memory of his mother, and the great temple of Preah Khan to the memory of his father, and the long inscriptions of these foundations record not only the dedication but the entire economy that sustained the cult, the villages and the lands assigned to it, the rice and the oil and the cloth measured out, the numbers of people set to its service, so that the religious establishment can be read as an institution kept on an account, its piety and its bookkeeping cut into the same stone. After this Buddhist period, the record shows a later reaction in which many of the Buddha images on the earlier monuments were cut away or recarved into other figures, the scars of that erasure still plainly visible on the stone where a seated Buddha was chiseled back to bare rock or turned into a meditating ascetic, a sign of the shifts of allegiance that the religion of the state passed through over the centuries. Through all of these changes, the basic ritual purpose of the great temples held, for they were not places built to gather a congregation in the manner of a hall raised to hold a crowd, but houses of the deity or the deified ancestor, dwellings in worked stone for the image and the cult, served by the attached populations and entered by the few, their narrow corbelled galleries and their stepped terraces, describing a path inward and upward toward the central sanctuary, set at the summit of the temple mountain, the ascent itself a part of the rite. The calendar and the orientation of the buildings were bound into all of this as well. The alignments of the principal temples set to the cardinal directions, and in the case of Angkor Wat, to the west and to observable risings of the sun upon its long axis at the turn of the year, so that the building stood as an instrument of the sky and the calendar as much as a house of the god, the light entering along the axis on the appointed mornings. What the inscriptions and the reliefs together give is a religious history that can be followed in sequence and in detail, Hindu and then Buddhist and then altered again by reaction, name deity by name deity and reign by reign, with the endowments counted and the images carved and recarved, and it is a history held in the stone rather than imagined from it, so that the sacred life of Angkor is among the best recorded parts of the whole site. Angkor was a city built around the management of water, and its year was the monsoon year, the long dry season and the heavy rains, and very nearly everything the Khmer engineered on the plain was a response to that division. The central works were the bares, the immense rectangular reservoirs that the builders laid out on the surface of the plain, embanked rather than excavated. their water held above the surrounding ground, behind long raised dikes of earth, and the largest of them, the western reservoir that the inscriptions and the later record call the West Baray, stretches some 8 kilometers in length and more than 2 in width, and held a sheet of standing water visible from a great distance, while the East Baray beside the old center, now dry, was nearly its match and is still legible on the ground as a vast rectangle outlined by its banks. These reservoirs were tied into a wide and deliberate network of canals, moats, feeder channels, and embankments that gathered the water of the wet season. The rains that fell on the plain and the runoff that came down from the hills of Phnom Kulen along the rivers, and led it across the engineered surface from the points where it entered to the basins where it was held, and from there out again to where it was wanted. The purpose of the system followed the rhythm of the seasons exactly, for in the wet months, the works caught the flood and slowed it and spread it and stored it, taking in and holding more water than the bare plain could otherwise have kept. And in the long dry months that followed, they let it out again in a managed way across the fields and along the channels, so that the engineered landscape carried a reserve of water through the dry season that the natural plain, left to itself, would simply have shed down to the lake and lost. The full extent of this hydraulic landscape was not visible from the ground in later centuries, because the channels and the field banks and the lesser embankments had softened into the surface over the long years and grown over with forest and with rice. And it was the survey from the air, and in particular the airborne laser survey that can read the bare shape of the ground beneath the standing vegetation, that traced the network in its full reach, mapping canals, distributary channels, embankments, roads, house mounds, and field systems spreading for many kilometers beyond the temple cores, and showing the city at last as a single vast engineered surface rather than a scatter of separate monuments in the forest. The barrays and the moats had a further character beyond the practical one, for they were broad sheets of held water set in a flat and open land, and they doubled the sky and the towers in their still surfaces and tempered the heat around the enclosures, and they were understood as religious works as much as useful ones, set in a considered relation to the temples they surrounded and fed, with small island shrines raised at their centers. The whole system worked with the same annual breathing that governed the Tonle Sap below it, the rise of the water with the southwest rains and its long withdrawal through the months that followed, and the Khmer engineering did not set itself against that rhythm, but extended and smoothed it, holding back a portion of the flood to carry the plain further into the dry season than it could otherwise have reached. In the wet season the plain ran with water, the rivers full and heavy with silt, the channels brimming, the barrays filling toward their banks, the rice land standing under its shallow, warm flood, and the work of the season was the planting and the tending of the crop under the long rains. In the dry season, the rivers fell and the fields hardened, and the stored water of the reservoirs and the channels became the margin between a sufficient year and a poor one, drawn down slowly as the rainless months went on, until the rains returned at last and the whole cycle began again. The seasons, in the end, were the engine of the place, and the great works of earth and water were the means by which the city held a large settled population on a plain whose natural condition was to stand drowned for part of the year and dry for the rest of it. And the measure of the achievement is in the scale of the network that the survey has recovered, a managed landscape of water reaching far out from the stone in every direction, laid over and working with the slow annual turn of flood and withdrawal that the plain and the lake had always known. The emptying of Angkor was gradual, and it is better described as a long settling than as any single ending, for the center of Khmer power drifted away from the plain over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, rather than being thrown down in a moment. The general movement was southward, toward the region of the lower river, around what is now Phnom Penh, where the court came to sit closer to the river trade and to the routes that carried goods down toward the sea. And as the seat of power moved, the role of Angkor as the working capital of the kingdom diminished, the patronage that had raised the temples and maintained the great works of water turning toward the new centers in the south. The hydraulic system that the city depended on shows the signs of this withdrawal of effort in its later phases, for the channels and the embankments register breaches, heavy silting, and patched and improvised repairs in their final layers, the marks of a network that was no longer being kept up at the scale that had first built it, and once the maintenance of so large and so interconnected a system was allowed to lapse. Its capacity to gather and hold and distribute the water of the plain fell away, a failure at one point throwing more strain onto the next. The centuries of that decline were also centuries of unusual swings in the weather of the region, and the record of the tree rings, read from long-lived trees whose annual growth holds a measure of the rains that fell in each year, registers severe alternations between drought and heavy monsoon across the 14th and 15th centuries, runs of failed or weak rains, and then years of damaging flood, and a water system already strained by reduced upkeep would have met those swings at a disadvantage, the long droughts emptying the reservoirs and starving the fields, and the violent floods that came after breaking the embankments and choking the channels that the lean years had left unrepaired. None of this amounts to a single sudden ending, and the evidence does not support one, for the plain was not abandoned in one season, and the population that had spread across it dispersed over generations rather than departing all at once, the court relocating, the great works falling slowly out of use and out of repair, the dense service populations of the temples thinning as the patronage that had supported them moved away to the south. The temples themselves stood through all of it, the laterite and the sandstone holding their lines while the timber city softened and sank back into the ground around them. And Angkor Wat in particular was never wholly emptied, for it continued as a place of active worship, passing in its use toward Buddhism and remaining a tended and visited temple through the centuries that followed. Its galleries swept and its sanctuaries used, even as the larger settlement around it returned to forest and field. What the record describes, then, is a center that lost its centrality, a capital whose very reason for standing where it stood, the great engineered surface for holding water and growing rice on a seasonal plain, depended on continuous and coordinated collective effort, and which gave way when that effort moved elsewhere, and when the weather turned hard against a system already weakened from within. The plain returned by slow degrees to forest and to ordinary cultivation, the reservoirs silting and the channels filling, and the field banks softening into the general surface, and the monuments were left standing within it, no longer the cores of a working capital, but the durable record of the centuries when the effort was at its height. The shape of the change is not collapse but withdrawal, the slow lifting of an enormous and sustained labor from a landscape that had been held in an artificial and productive state by that labor alone, and the quiet settling of the plain back toward what it had been before the city was ever assembled upon it, level and forested, and breathing with the lake to the south, the worked stone remaining where it had been set. What stands now is stone in forest, and the reading of it goes on. The temples of Angkor lie within the bounds of the Angkor Archaeological Park, the great monuments and the wide ground between them protected together as a single landscape, and the site was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1992 as one of the major archaeological landscapes of the region, and has been studied and conserved by a long succession of teams in the years since. The laterite and the sandstone have held their lines across the centuries. The 5 towers of Angkor Wat still standing plumb above their moat, and still reflected in it, the heads of the Bayon still turned outward upon their crowded towers, the long galleries still carrying their carved processions and their ranks of celestial dancers, while the timber city that once surrounded all of this has gone entirely back into the soil, so that a person moving through the park today walks among the durable houses of the gods across a ground that has quietly reclaimed the houses of the people. At the Temple of Ta Prohm, the forest has been allowed to remain in possession. The great pale roots of the silk cotton and the strangler fig trees grown down over and into the masonry, splitting the courses in one place and binding them together in another. And the temple is held in that condition by deliberate choice, kept as an image of the long and patient contest between the building and the forest, rather than cleared back to its bare stone lines, as the more visited temples have been. The plain itself is still being read, and the reading has been remade in recent years, for the airborne laser survey has recovered the buried network of canals, channels, embankments, roads, and house mounds across many kilometers of the surrounding ground, returning the dispersed living city to the map and showing the temples, at last, not as isolated monuments, but as the surviving stone cores of a far larger engineered landscape that the soil had kept faithfully and the eye, from the ground, had never been able to see whole. The conservation of the standing stone goes on alongside the survey. The consolidation of the leaning walls and the loosened vaults, the careful management of the trees that both threaten and hold the masonry, the patient recording and translation of the inscriptions, and the reliefs that make so much of the site legible. And the moats and the surviving buray still fill and fall with the season. The great western reservoir still taking the wet season water and giving it back through the dry months as it was built to do, the held water still doubling the towers in its surface as the light goes down over it. The stones remain, the city that was assembled here, the timber houses on their many thousands of mounds, the open markets held on the bare ground, the dense dependent populations of the temples, the court at the center of its walled enclosure, all of that is no longer present on the plain, and yet the pattern of it is still legible, in the lines that the survey has traced beneath the forest, and in the monuments that hold their old places above the recovered ground. At the close of the day, the light comes low and level across the moat of Angkor Wat, and the 5 towers stand dark against a softening sky, and the water lies flat and unmoving below them, holding their inverted shape, and the forest beyond the enclosure goes slowly quiet, and the great plain settles once more into the warm dark under the same 2 seasons that governed it from the start, level and patient, holding what was set upon it long after the hands that set it have gone.